Now, as we were saying a few moments ago, should we judge politicians by their family members? It's the debate question today. I ask it because of the storm breaking over the heads of one of Britain's most gilded couples, the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, and his, I think it's fair to say, fabulously wealthy wife, Akshata Murthy. She has non-dom status. That means she does not have to pay UK tax on income earned abroad. We were planning on getting into what that non-dom means with a tax expert. That may yet happen, but we may do it tomorrow as a story. But today there's a more general question, and that more general question is whether, when it comes to politics, we can heap the sins of one family member onto another. Think of the scrutiny faced by previous PM's wives, Sherry Blair, the current one, Carrie Johnson. What about the role of children? Remember some of the scrutiny the Blair children used to face, for instance. Was it right to sanction even Vladimir Putin's daughters because their father is a global pariah? They don't get to choose their dad, do they? We're joined in the studio by Peter Whittle, founder and director of the New Culture Forum think tank, and the writer and broadcaster Mike Yardley, who joins us, who will be joining us soon. So, Peter, you're going to have to hold the fort until he does. Sure. I think it's a fascinating story, this, about the limits of where you can take politics in terms of hinting at a slur.
Yes.
She's done nothing illegal.
Absolutely nothing. I think that, basically, from my point of view, it seems this is pure sort of political mischief-making, really, because there's no question of any facilitating on his part. There's nothing like that. It's just that basically she's very, very rich, I guess, and that is what maybe the left don't like, particularly when you've got, it's a Tory chancellor at a very difficult time with the cost of living, etc. But really, I think that on the general point, Colin, I was thinking about this on the way here, that Randolph Churchill was Churchill's son, and he was, by all accounts, a pretty ne'er-do-well character. Liked his drink, all of this. Should that reflect on Churchill? Or should it at the time? Or
Randolph Churchill was Churchill's father,
and his son,
was called Randolph as well.
Exactly.
Yeah, and interestingly, Randolph Churchill, the father, married an American heiress.
Yes, indeed.
As opposed to an Indian heiress.
Those days.
to clear your debts.
Country park going, But, family members, you were posing the question, family members generally. I think, people should not be held to account for their family. OK, well, we've got Mike Yardley. Let's turn to for a different perspective, maybe, from him. Hi to you, Mike. What do you make of this cloud that's hanging over the Sunaks?
Well, I think the issue really is the tax status of the Chancellor's family, indeed any politician's family, a legitimate sphere of inquiry. And I think it is. I don't think there's any suggestion here that Mrs. Sunak has done anything illegal. The question is really, has the Chancellor himself, or indeed other politicians, are they benefiting from non-dom status? And that is something I think we should talk about. Meantime, it also brings up perhaps the much more important issue, is how can these incredibly wealthy people really be in touch with a lot of ordinary people? Now, the Chancellor has presented himself as a tax-cutting Chancellor, as a sort of Thatcherite, if you like. But the truth of it is we've never paid so much tax ever, not since the 1950s, perhaps. 70% or so is what the average person pays in tax. And can the Chancellor really be in touch with a lot of ordinary people? It's not just a question, of a mum who might be living in a tower block somewhere with a couple of kids. We're talking about not just low-income people now. We're talking about middle-income people who are finding it increasingly hard to cope. Can the Chancellor and do other very, very wealthy politicians really understand their lot? It seems at the moment to me that this country is heading to disaster. Between fuel bills, farmer friends tell me that food's going up as well. We have got all sorts of problems coming down the line, and I'm not convinced the government's doing anything like enough to address those issues.
Peter Whittle, I remember when I was at my previous employer, I'd done an interview with George Osborne. He wasn't quite Chancellor, he was Shadow Chancellor at the time. He got very cross. In fact, he rang my boss and complained that I'd had the temerity to suggest that somebody who was, if not a full-blown aristocrat themselves, then who had married into the aristocracy and was worth a few bob, could really understand what it was like to be poor. Politicians get really sensitive about this, the idea they can't relate to, what it is to buy a pint of milk, etc. Peter, does it matter?
Well, I think in a way, you see, Mike has sort of proved my original point we were talking about, which is that he was saying, how can somebody like Rishi Sunak and his wife, how can they possibly understand, what people are going through? That is a legitimate argument that we could have at any time. But I think that this was quite specific. This seemed to be anger at her financial arrangements, which all seemed to be above board. I think we go down a very dark route, in a way, if you start pouring over people's families, what their financial arrangements are. It could even be what their sexual arrangements are, or whatever they've done in the past. And that somehow this is some kind of moral judgment that should be shared by the politician involved. And I think that's not the right way to go. But I think that if you want to talk about should people who are chancellors and prime ministers, should they, for example, should there be a limit to what they should have in terms of wealth? I mean, you can argue about that if you like. I think it's a pretty spurious argument, really, but it's a different one.
Mike, just in terms of, the propriety of the thing, I mean, we're told that when he became a minister, Rishi Sunak made abundantly clear what his tax situation was. She, because you can't have both dual nationalities as an Indian, she has to, born and brought up in India. She chooses to be an Indian citizen still. Earnings from India are paid as tax in India. I think income tax there is about 30p in the pound, for instance. So there is no sense in which she is not fulfilling her tax obligations in the jurisdiction to which she belongs. You could argue there's another question here, which nobody's really touched yet, which is if Rishi Sunak, as some people feel he ought to, becomes the next Prime Minister, whether we can have a Prime Minister whose spouse is a foreign national.
And I think I'm not quite sure of the precise terming of the law, but I think she has to say that she's going back to live in India one day to benefit from this non-dom status. I tend to agree with Peter, though. I mean, I don't think we should bring in people's personal lives too much, but I do think that this issue of the enormous wealth of some politicians and how that brings them out of touch with ordinary people is something that we should be discussing. And I do say that I don't think that the government is looking forward to the future. At the moment, we are heading towards disaster. Many people can't pay their bills. More people aren't going to be able to pay their bills. That's going to lead to social and political chaos in Britain. And a Tory government, a Conservative government of all people, should be addressing this problem.
Peter Whittle, I wonder, just on the point about whether politicians' private lives and their family, their relations, familial relations matter. We're talking here about financial matters, financial matters. What about moral questions? I mean, I remember doing a monologue on GBNews about Matt Hancock when it was found he'd been unfaithful. And I take the view, and it's a really unfashionable view, that actually if somebody's prepared to lie to their spouse, they're more inclined perhaps to lie to the voter. Really old-fashioned view. But I think it's a legitimate question at least.
Well, I mean, Colin, I like to think I'm old-fashioned. But actually, I don't really think that is a particularly old-fashioned view. If anything, the old-fashioned view was that basically people's private lives were their own. If you look at some of the great leaders we've had in Britain, Lloyd George, he was known as the GOAT, for example, because he was forever being unfaithful all over the place. And, it didn't change his political status as such, and neither should it. The difference with someone like Matt Hancock, and this is why I would agree with you, this is outright hypocrisy. If you're telling people that they should, follow a certain rule and you don't do it yourself in a very blatant way, then that is quite different. All bets are off then, I think.
Mike Yardley, final word. I mean, I think this is pretty low politics, actually, but the job's done, isn't it? Now, when people look at Rishi Sunak and his wife in the future, pictures of them, it will leave a bad taste for some people. There's absolutely no logical basis for it. I think that's quite grubby politics.
No, I think you make a point, and I don't think it is really fair on her. But Rishi Sunak has presented himself to the public as a tax-cutting chancellor, and he hasn't done that. And I think the other issue, the philosophical and political issue we need to discuss, is how much influence does big money have on politics? Look at the US, for example. You cannot become president unless you are a multi-billionaire. In our own politics, How much does money hold sway? These are important issues, and you don't have to be a socialist or a Marxist, and I'm certainly neither of those, to consider these issues and to consider what impact this vast wealth has on our politics.